Sometimes a book title really catches your eye, and this one, Why International Organisations Hate Politics, certainly piqued our interest. The authors Marieke and Lucile Maerten questioned the apolitical claim of international organisations. Through current and historical examples and case studies, they systematically analyse the practices and logic of depoliticization, throwing light onto everyday practices in international organisations. Professor Vincent Pouliot at McGill University describes their book as the final nail in the functionalist coffin of a depoliticized global governance. I'm Amy Smith, and you're listening to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives devoted to advancing the conversation on multilateralism. This is a perspective-changing book, and it was a huge pleasure to have Marieke and Lucile Maerten join me for a conversation to explore their work. Enjoy listening. So, hello, welcome to The Next Page. Thank you for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourselves briefly for our listeners and just tell us how you came to write this book that has such a provocative title?
Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Marieke. I am an associate professor in political science and international relations at Sciences Po Grenoble in France. I have been working for 10 years now on international organization. I made my PhD on the International Labour Organization, and I'm working with Lucile for, I would say, 10 years as well. We've known each other for a long time since we were actually master students and then PhD students. So our interest for that book, and I will probably explain a little bit later, but came from very similar questions that we were confronted with in our very different areas, because Lucile is specialized in environment and I'm specialized more in social and economic multilateralism.
And Lucile?
Thank you very much for having us. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to present our work. So I'm Lucile Maerten. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Lausanne. And my work, also like Marieke, is focusing on the study of international organizations, mostly in the field of global environmental politics, but also on international security. And I've been working on this project on depoliticization for a few years now. And I'm really glad to have this opportunity to present the book today.
So the title, tell us more.
So you said that you talked about the provocative title of the book. To be honest, we're clearly not the first to have used this expression. Actually, we borrowed it, so to say, to Colin Hay. Colin Hay is a political scientist. He wrote a book in 2007 called "Why We Hate Politics," and it was already an attempt to theorize that question of depoliticization, and he made distinctions between different kinds of depoliticization, the governmental depoliticization through delegation practices, the public depoliticization through privatization, and also private depoliticization through the denial of political problems. We were very much inspired by this title. And for the subtitle, which is Depoliticizing the World, clearly it's also a reference to the famous book, at least in the field of international organization, from Michael Barnett and Martha Finmore, Rules for the World, 2004. And it's also a way for us to show the link between two literatures, literature in political science, but also the literature on international organization, which not always dialogue with each other. So this is the reason for the title.
So the book, tell us a bit more about how it fits into the existing literature and what makes it relevant for advancing our understanding of international organizations.
Well, the books is really at the crossroads of different literatures. The first one is broad literature on what is called functionalism, which is, of course, a key concept in order to understand this apolitical claim that we tackle in the book. Functionalism, which is also related to technocracy. The second trend of literature is vast amount of articles and books on anti-politics and bureaucratic multilateralism, the fact that we don't consider only international organizations through their member states, but also as bureaucracy. And of course, this is linked with these depoliticization mechanisms that we identify. And the other one, which is interesting because it's not restricted to international organization, is the literature on expertise, knowledge, and technicization, which is very much transversal, in fact, and doesn't only tackle international organization. So giving these different traditions, you might say, okay, but what's new if there are so many books and articles already on the subject? Actually, when we were finishing the book, there are actually two other books that just came out. A book from Frédéric Maerten, political scientist at the University of Montreal, who wrote on the politicization of the European Commission, and his book is entitled The Political Commissioner. And also at the same time, in 2021, Jens Steffek wrote a book on international organization as technocratic utopia. We actually had a workshop with him to discuss the similarities on our two books. So even though we have many workshops organized and vast amount of literature, I think there is still more to say about it. And clearly, if we have to make a second edition, we will have to include way more literature, I guess.
Very interesting. So, Lucile, do you want to add something?
Yes, just to go back to the relevance of the book in the study of international organizations. I think what we addressed in the book is that we propose a systematic analysis of something that is very common in many international organizations. It's a bit of an elephant in the room, as Marieke was just saying, that there was quite a lot of literature that addressed depoliticization, but most often depoliticization was not questioned, especially in the case of the functionalist work, or it was marginally addressed. It was not directly the main question that was at the core of the different literature that was before the book. And so what we tried to do in this manuscript is to bring together very different case studies with this conceptual ambition to have an original framework that is applicable in very different type of institutional settings. And so I think what makes it relevant for advancing our understanding of IOs is specifically the fact that we identify practices that are very diverse, like delivering technical assistance, using ready-to-use formats, or using even delaying tactics. All of that, it's quite different, but we put it in a coherent way in this effort to have a typology of those practices and logics of depoliticization. And so it's going inside the inner dynamics of IOs, but also questioning the impact of those inner dynamics onto the global problems that international organizations were created to solve.
Thank you, Lucile. We'll come back to the practices in a moment, but first, I love it that you start your book with an exclamation that you've heard around international organizations. We don't do politics. Now, it's certainly something I've heard working here. But first, tell us how you're defining politics. What is this paradox that you take as your starting point?
Maybe I will start with the paradox. Maybe it's not so much a paradox, in fact, than a tension between, as you say, these apolitical claims. Everyone who's been studying or working for an international organization has heard, we're not here to do politics. We don't do politics. So we hear that in very different contexts. I talked about my research in the International Labour Organization, and Lucile working more in the field of environment, in UNEP, but also in the UN. So there is a tension between these apolitical claims and the fact that they evolve in very political environments, which is why the definition of politics is, of course, so important. And we try to tackle the issue in the introduction. Let's say, without being too technical, that we adopt a rather inclusive view on politics. It's both professional, specialized activities, but also more mundane, private practices, as long as they have an impact on the daily lives of a broader collectivity, let's say. And as long as these practices, whether they are performed by professional or by ordinary citizen, as long as they involve consideration about the legitimacy of detaining power and making decision, the exercise of authority and the delivery of public policy. And of course, in this consideration, you have conflict and debates. And very often when you have conflict and debates, it's a signal of politicization and the presence of politics, but not exclusively, because politics is also about cooperation. And this is maybe where we differ from the dominant literature on politics, because most of the time politics is very much seen through the lenses of conflict and opposition and debates. And we think that you also have to include more cooperative dynamic. And the other reason we had to take on the more inclusive definition of politics is because if you define politics only as we do at the national level, in terms of partisan cleavages, for instance, you will exclude international organization, because within international organization, you don't have the same lines of tensions of political parties, for instance. So if you want to make politics also fit for the realm of international organization, you need to be a little bit more inclusive. And being inclusive doesn't mean that we think that politics is necessarily everywhere all the time. It varies. Some issues can become political at some point and be less political at others. So it's not everywhere all the time, but it's more contextual, but being attentive to both professional and non-professional actors and activities.
And so whilst we're on definitions, and just so that we all understand, explain to us a bit your notion of depoliticization.
So linking with the fact that we have this inclusive view of politics and that we say that not everything is political all the time, what we consider as being a depoliticization process is precisely this depoliticization process that is different like from apolitical. Like when you say that something is apolitical, what you mean is that it's non-political. It doesn't have a political character. When we talk about depoliticization, the D refers to the process of taking away the political character. And that's what we study by defining depoliticization as a process in which we minimize, conceal, or even eliminate politics within international organizations. And so it's a process that needs to be contextualized because it's enacted through daily practices, but it also follows institutional logics and individual tactics. And why is it important to look at that? It's because it has political meaning and implication for global governance and international organization, because that's how international organizations function on a daily basis, but that's also how we will frame and we will enact solutions for the global problems that are at play on international relations.
So now we're on to the practice. And in talking about international organizations, you specifically talk about how they perform depoliticization. And you note 3 ways in which this is done. And the first one is that IOs have, discourses have a tendency to reduce political issues to technical ones, especially through using expert knowledge and so on. What have you observed?
So this is something that we see in many organizations where you have expertise that is produced by international organizations that tend to simplify very complex social facts or social problems. Our take compared to the literature on expertise and international organization is to focus on the claim of expertise. Here, what we say is that claiming being an expert in international organization or international bureaucrat, but also diplomats, provides a credential that can isolate the actors from politics, because the expertise would be the reason why this actor is legitimate to intervene on this field. By doing so, it creates a distance with the politics. And this also leads, in terms of interpreting the problems at stake, into a technical interpretation that tends to reduce the complexity, also for practical reasons, and we'll come back to that. And so we build on the sociology of quantification, for example, to discuss the way international organizations use models, indexes, numbers, without disclosing the political decisions that are taken in the calculation process. If I take an example of the UN Development Program, so UNDP uses now the Human Development Index. When the Human Development Index was put in place, the idea was to challenge an understanding of development through the GDP only. But this index is still just one number. It's just the addition of 3 variables, not even a very specific ponderation between them. And so having this number at the end, it's still debatable to use those numbers instead of another more complex understanding of what it means to be developed. And so this is the type of practices that we were able to analyze in the different cases. And I think what's interesting also when we look at the different international organizations is that we don't always have the same mechanism that we can see in terms of the link between expertise, technicization, and international organization, because it depends on their mandates. For example, the case of UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, its mandate, it's connected to its expertise on environmental assessment. So it's quite connected to a form of technical expertise. So it's easier for UNEP to use this type of technicization practice. But if you take, for example, the World Bank would have more the tendency to use econometrics compared to environmental assessment because it's economists that are inside the World Bank. But you have also other types of knowledge, like experience is very used as a knowledge, especially for humanitarian organization. If you take the case of the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, their experience in camp management was used as a form of claim to be able to depoliticize their role in intervening after a natural disaster. And so here, again, you have different types of knowledge that is used to participate in the process of depoliticization.
Your second point is on neutrality. How is neutrality used for depoliticization? And can you give us an example?
Yes. So first, we have to say that neutrality is a very challenging concept. It's difficult to define because it's used with regard to very different issues. I mean, neutrality in academia is not necessarily the same as in the public service, and definitely also not completely the same in the field of international organization. But in the field of international organization, neutrality has historically been and still is a key concept, especially with regard, for instance, to humanitarian intervention and also in peacekeeping. It entails very much this idea of not taking side in hostilities, but also not to engage, more generally speaking, into political or ideological controversies. And most importantly, this neutral positioning is seen as a way to secure the trust, the confidence of the parties involved in a dispute or a conflict, and therefore to facilitate the intervention of international organizations. So in the book, we don't necessarily take on the challenge to assess whether international organizations are in fact neutral or not. What we take seriously is the neutral claims, and we adopt a more practice-oriented view on neutrality. So how is neutrality produced? How does it circulate? And most importantly, how does it serve the purpose of depoliticization? And here, the answer relies in the way what we call neutral formatting, and I will let Lucile give some example, how neutral formatting is used to reduce the political space for debate and contradiction by relying, for instance, on successful and experience-based justification in displacing the political agencies from international organizations to the audience it targets. And we'll give the example of training. And finally, how international organizations are very effective in turning information and facts into actual normative recommendations like best practices. And we see that very much also in the case of breastfeeding. It both relies, of course, on scientific expertise. So it also relates to what Lucile was talking about the production of expertise. But by saying what is good for a child, for instance, it becomes very, very quickly what people should actually do. So you always have a very thin frontier between informing but also recommending the best way to go.
So Lucile, would you like to tell us a bit more about training and how that comes into the picture? Not only how neutrality is produced, but about its dissemination, as you've just been talking about, Marieke.
Yes, so training for us was a very good example of how international organizations rely on ready-to-use formats that displays the political agency. So let me explain. International organizations, they produce these very accessible tools where they then encourage the reappropriation of those tools by the targeted audience. And by doing this reappropriation to the audience, they reverse ownership. The political agency is not put on the international organization that produced the training, but on the participants that are in charge of taking the training and then applying the information that is turned into a recommendation. If I take a very concrete example, I studied an online training program for peacekeepers that was dedicated to the protection of the environment. the topic was highly political. States disagree on what peacekeepers should be doing on the environment. It was different types of practices. It would imply also changes in terms of procurement, what type of material peacekeepers should bring with themselves. So this was quite a political topic. By doing this online training, it moves the responsibility of the application of what the training is saying that peacekeepers should do on the participants. It's not about the organization. It's not about UNEP or UNITAR which created the training, but it displays the political agency towards the participants. And it's really this reverse ownership that is part of the depoliticization process that we studied.
So continuing about dissemination, tell us a little bit more about how you see the power of storytelling as part of this depoliticizing procedure.
Storytelling is used more and more within internationalization, especially in the way that internationalization creates undebatable stories. They can base that on success stories. They can base that on lesson learned, for example, where there is no need to discuss it again because we learned the lesson, right? We don't need to discuss with the past. And so that's one technique. And the other one is just to call to common sense. It makes sense. It's logical. It's even universal. Who could say no to ending poverty, to put an end to hunger? So for sure, this makes it as a very shared success story or storytelling that internationalization use on a daily basis, but that actually tend to close down the debates because you can agree on saying, okay, we should end poverty, but the way we will end it, that's very political. And here, if we follow the storytelling, it's a way that internationalization managed to bypass political division by bringing this very shared common sense stories, but at the same time, at the expense of an important debate that we should have on how we would address those problems.
So you've talked about technicization, we've talked about neutrality, and the third point you bring up is about time. So how is time used as a means to depoliticize issues, and in what ways have you seen this used?
So as you mentioned, this is the third type of practice that we identify in the book, the time-related depoliticization practices. And we build on the growing interest on time and temporality in international relations to think about time as a resource. So we think about time in the way that it can be played with or even instrumentalized, because internationalization, or within internationalization, diplomats and staff, they can use time to postpone decision-making, to decrease political momentum, to lose political interest, to the point that we can even forget past political debates. And Marieke will illustrate with a few examples.
Yes, we've illustrated this chapter through three cases, actually, which all the three entail the different steps of the process of time-related depoliticization. So we've talked about the UN Security Council reform, the ILO reform of the governing body, and finally the reform of the voting system. So they may seem very different at first sight, but in fact, they are all related to problems and challenges of representativeness. And in those three cases, although in quite different historical periods, because for the ILO, we're talking already of a process starting in the 1920s. For the UN Security Council reform, it's more in the 1960s. For the IMF, becomes very salient more in the 1990s. But in all the three cases, we observe the same tactics of delaying the time of the decision making, diluting the issues which are at stake, which reinforce the delaying tactics by saying, oh yes, of course, there is the problem of the veto, but there is also a problem of the voting power and the question of geographic representation. And so it adds more problem, and then the question is complexified, and then it delays, it postpones the time of the decision making. And then you also have the fact that as time goes by and the fact that these issues are presented as urgent issues, important for the legitimacy of the institution, the fact that you repeat that this is urgent, it routinizes in a way the emergency. We had that very much after the 2008 crisis, with this idea that we had to reform urgently international financial institutions. questions. It was very urgent at the time, but the question is still open. And finally, and this is very much the case for the International Labour Organization, it comes to a time through which, as time goes by, members start even to forget about the past debates, and then the political momentum of the reform is completely lost, because if people don't even remember the accumulation of debates, tiny reforms which were taken, then it becomes more and more difficult to reopen these debates.
So with all these practices, why and to what end? You say, and I quote from your book, that international organizations justify their existence and intervention by defining their action as a concrete answer to specific needs while following the constraints of their mandate and institutional designs. And you choose a historical example of the ILO to illustrate this point about taking a functional, pragmatic approach. Can you just explain a little bit more about that?
Yes. So actually, maybe we should remind that functionalism and pragmatism are different paradigms. And this is an argument that proposition that we make in the book, they share the same focus on needs and action. So in that way, they are very relevant to articulate. And it was actually David Mitrani who said in the 1940s that the International Labour Organization was the typical functionalist organization. The ILO was created in 1919, so just after the First World War, and its specific feature, and this is the reason also why the ILO is a little bit famous, at least in the circle of international organization specialists and practitioners, is because it is a tripartite organization composed of workers, employers, and governments. And this structure is particularly emblematic of the functionalist way of thinking. It was thought to be more effective because the idea was, in order to really produce international labor standards that would be effective, that will be understood and really applied by the workers and the enterprises, you needed to have them around the table to do the negotiations. So starting with this representative structure, the ILO was anchored in a way in this very functionalist, pragmatic way of thinking. And it continues, for instance, when the ILO was created at the same time than the League of Nations. And there were very common rhetoric about the fact that the ILO and the League of Nations were completely different, because the ILO was not focusing on political issues. That was the business of the League of Nations, and the ILO was focusing on technical issues. And many have said that it was the reason the ILO had survived to the Second World War. And it continues like that. For instance, the ILO was very pioneer in developing training centers. We've talked about this practice. It created the International Training Center in Turin in 1960s. So a very much need-based approach, which is emblematic of this functional way of thinking. It's actually Jens Steffek also and Leonie Holthaus in an article in the European Journal of International Relations. They talk not about functionalism, but they talk about this kind of welfare internationalism that is embodied by international organizations like the ILO, those who put forward really the social and economic needs of the people rather than more political considerations.
That sounds very attractive, doesn't it, really? This idea of being depoliticized to facilitate this approval from governments in order to be operational. Isn't it an advantage, or do you see consequences to following this route?
For sure, it's quite an attractive route, and it's quite practical. And we show that in the book. Most often, it's also the only way for international organizations to actually be able to do what they were supposed to do. And so for many international organization staff, they do play the apolitical card to receive the authorization to intervene and to achieve the mandate. And in that sense, it's also how neutrality is presented as a way of action. It's a way to be able to act. It's by being neutral. And this pragmatic decision to play on the apolitical claims, we've seen that in many different cases. I can maybe mention one, the case of the ENSEC initiative, the Environmental Security Initiative, that intervened in Central Asia at the end of the Cold War. Here, it was clear, because it was so politicized at the end of the Cold War, that the organization needed to be seen as completely impartial and completely not involved in the politics of what it was constructing the world after the Cold War. And so they played the focus on environmental rehabilitation, on environmental cooperation to be able to intervene. But one of the consequences of using this card is that it constrains the actors to maintain the status quo. And you cannot disrupt the existing power relationship because you give them tacit approval. And it can't be, you can't have radical changes when you have to apply this pragmatic way of doing international relations. And another consequence that I would like to emphasize is how it tends to stigmatize politics, because it's seen as if politics is necessarily bad for cooperation. And that's something I think it's important also to pinpoint when you see, yes, it's practical, but it also has unintended consequences.
If I may add also something on these consequences, it's also in terms of the responsibility avoidance that it leads to. International organizations have become specialists in blame shifting and really trying to avoid putting themselves in politically difficult positions. We explore that actually in the last analytical chapters on logic, the search for different scapegoats. So it can be either the governments, which are stigmatized as the main responsible, the inefficiency, or it can be the individuals, for instance, when there are scandals about sexual violence in peacekeeping operations. The UN focuses on those individuals with bad behaviors, but not necessarily questioning the structures or organizational culture that make those kind of violations possible. Or also in the case of genocide, when the UN, for instance, recognize a general responsibility, but in the end, making the guilt disappear, because if everyone is responsible, who is really responsible? And I think this was really the added value of the book by Michael Barnett, Eyewitness to Genocide, where he really tries to assess this differentiated responsibility of the different parts of the UN, going from the UN Security Council to the role of France or to the role of the Secretary General, to try to identify more who is responsible and try to overcome this discourse on we are not responsible because we don't do politics.
I must admit, it was quite a difficult section of your book to read. It felt a little bit uncomfortable. Now, you also give an interesting example of the way international organizations compete for legitimacy and sometimes the monopoly of the legitimacy in writing about a conflict that happened between the ILO and ISO. What is this link between depoliticization and legitimacy?
If I take the example of the ILO and ISO, and here I'm very much indebted to the work of Colin Ruvet and Camille Gagné, who are both experts on the ISO, it goes back to the confrontation that arose at the beginning of the 1990s, because the ISO started to produce standards on issues like health and safety at work, corporate social responsibilities, human resources, which were considered as a monopoly of the ILO. And the reason for conflict was not just, even if it was a reason, but it was not just the ILO defending its monopoly and relevance. It was also because actually they defend two different political visions of labor relations and democracy. And so what I find interesting is the way they have tried to depoliticize, to enter into these very radical different views on democracy and labor relations, to focus on the area where they could potentially work together. But in the end, this depoliticization has failed because confrontation came back, especially in 2017, and the two organizations decided to stop collaborating because the ISO would not recognize the superiority of the international labor standards produced by the ILO. So, which shows that sometimes depoliticization can actually not be so successful in managing conflict among organizations.
And if I may jump in on this link between legitimacy and depoliticization, what we try to show in this chapter is to show that there is a mutual reinforcement of both processes. What do I mean by that is that depoliticization helps organizations to gain legitimacy, and that has been shown by other scholars like Annabelle Litteuse-Monet on the case of the UNESCO, for example, how the depoliticization processes is a way for international organizations to gain legitimacy, especially on topics that they were not on their mandate or on their agenda at first. It's a way to be able to justify an intervention that is a bit of a mission creep. It's an expansion of their mandate. But once the legitimacy over a field of action is there, once there is even a monopoly, that reinforces depoliticization because it legitimizes who has the right voice on the matter. It means that different or alternative voices are less heard or less legitimated. And one example is the way how the monopoly of the UN Climate Convention and its famous COPs on climate change, they have the monopoly on the climate change discussion. And this has been used as a reason why other international organizations should not be talking and discussing climate change. And that has been used, for example, by some delegates, member states delegates at the UN Security Council, saying the Security Council should not be talking about climate change because climate change is to be discussed within the Climate Convention. And you see here how the monopoly of the legitimacy also reinforced depoliticization because it closed the space for political debates.
So your book is a very careful analysis and very well-constructed argument throughout. But what I also find interesting is the way that you show how depoliticization is also contested within international organizations. And for example, you mentioned the strike in the 1970s of the FAO staff who were protesting about the way the organization was promoting the green revolution. And whilst in their opinion, they were saying that the FAO was masquerading as a neutral technical forum. Would you tell us more about this other side of the coin and how depoliticization is also resisted?
The case of the FAO, this is from the work of Birgit Müller and Nora McKeon. So they both work on the FAO, and what they've shown is that the FAO managed to render conflicting political and economic interests technical, making it as if political interests were not a political problem, but it was technical. And the FAO organized the forums that were supposed to be inclusive in terms of participants and in terms of the discussion. But at the end, it was still promoting the green revolution biotechnologies. That was its main line of action. And so this depoliticization process was very criticized from the inside. Not all staff agreed on that, and that's how they went on strike. And I think this is a good example of the limits of depoliticization. Depoliticization can be counterproductive, it can create even more space for politics, and it can be resisted as well within international organizations, but also from the outside. And I think what this tension, like the failure or the resistance against depoliticization, shows that depoliticization and politicization can happen simultaneously within international organizations. We should not take them as in opposition. And the book that Frédéric Maerten wrote on the political commissioners that was mentioned earlier, in his book, he shows that the political work within international organizations, he shows how some actors actively seek to bring more politics. And this research is completely complementary of our book because all of that, it's about agency. It's about how you're functioning. It's about how you politics. So depoliticization and politicization happens at the same time, but there are different mechanisms that we should study independently and then together.
And if I may add also on the cases that I was talking about on representativeness, I think representativeness is also a good example where depoliticization can become counterproductive because the fact that you have so many delaying tactics and dilution of issues, it can create some kind of lassitude of institutional fatigue, but it can also create frustration, which can also generate new claims actually and resist resistance to these attempts to not talk about that anymore. If you look at the ILO, it's no coincidence that in the 1990s you have the first director general coming also from the southern country. It was Juan Somavia from Chile, and a few weeks ago a new director general from Togo. I think Gilbert Humbo was elected. So, and it was the first time that you have a director general coming from the so-called African group. So I think it shows that even though there are attempts to depoliticize, you still have resistance to that, and members or certain members don't want a certain issue to be buried.
So for people who work in the international organizations, the staff, the diplomats, what do you hope they take from your book?
The whole project of the book would not have been able to be conducted without the diplomats, the staff, because it's based on the experience that they agreed to share with us in interviews. It's based on the fact that they opened the door so that academics were able to go inside international organization, to take the time and the distance maybe to identify those trends and tendencies that go well beyond what individuals can anticipate. We do not imply that people, IO staff or diplomats wake up every morning and they say, yeah, let's depoliticize the world today. It's much more nuanced than that. And what we hope is that we help make sense of some of the individual dilemmas that staffs and diplomats can face, and also shed light on the unintended consequences, because we do need to reflect on those consequences, especially in the current context of a legitimacy crisis of international organization. We need to rethink the role of technocracy. Like the functionalist project is still very much in the mind of lots of people within international organization, and thinking that technocracy is a tool for peace that needs to be challenged, because what we see in the different cases that we studied is that bypassing politics to facilitate cooperation might just actually backlash on the long run. And so that's why also research and like academics and practitioners should be able to be in dialogue to discuss those type of issues.
And so finally, what do you think are the implications for multilateralism today?
Well, I think Lucile has used an interesting word. She talked about backlash, and I think that we are living maybe critical times also for the legitimacy of international organizations. International organizations are maybe not so popular as they might think. They might appear sometimes away from ordinary citizens, although their mandate is precisely about the needs, as we said, of the ordinary citizens. I think there are more and more criticism about the technocratic, and not in a good way, the technocratic nature about this international organization. So I think that maybe our book opens also new venues for research in order to really tackle the question of to what extent can international organization be more democratic, maybe more transparent. And the key question is to what extent is depoliticization more or less linked to these democratization processes. You will have some people saying depoliticization is anti-democratic. We don't say that. We think that sometimes depoliticization might be very useful and in a very democratic way, but not always. And this is why we think that we should maybe investigate more this aspect, because it's clearly linked to the legitimacy crisis of multilateral organizations today.
Lucile, final thoughts.
The fact that the book is structured in such a way that we could read each chapter individually, and I'm sure that some readers will focus on specific dimension, but we would really like to encourage the readers to take the opportunity to read the whole book, because it's really useful to capture the coherence of the argument, but also all those nuances that we wanted to put forward in the study of international organization and global governance.
Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.